Yeah, I do think that both the drought in the United States earlier this year, but certainly Hurricane Sandy, which was quite timely in the fact that it was just a few days before the U.S. election, when all the cameras were focused on the United States anyway, certainly brought additional attention to climate. But the fact is, and we'll see how much of that will be an influence in Doha, but the fact is that the Doha deliverables have been prepared throughout the whole year. So there's nothing in Doha that is now all of a sudden being put on the table because of recent events. And in Doha, basically, governments need to look at a package of issues where I would say the overall overriding concept is to take many of the issues that have been under design and under negotiation for quite a few years, take them into implementation. So under that, I would say first and foremost, the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol has been under negotiation for quite a while and is now ready to be put into immediate implementation on January 1, 2013. Countries need to make the final decisions on the rules that are going to be operative for the second commitment period, but they need to launch that second commitment period. Second thing that goes from design into implementation is an array, a broad group of institutional arrangements that governments have been working on under the convention, not under the protocol, under the convention, also for quite a few years since the Bali Action Plan, that there are now at different points in their operationalization, but that it is clear that after Doha, they all need to be operative and beginning to support developing countries. And then, of course, we also have the new kid on the block, which comes from Durban, the Durban platform, which actually needs not to go into implementation, but rather into further specification with regard to the work plan that governments are going to use to move toward that universal agreement in 2015 on the one hand, and also how are governments going to enhance the ambition of adaptation, mitigation, and finance right now, even waiting before 2015, so now and beyond 2015. So that whole package has been worked on for a year, and I am always cautiously but certainly optimistic that they will take that package forward in Doha.
Are you concerned at all about suggestions that some blocs may seek to try and renegotiate what was agreed in Durban?
No, I believe that is a concern that has been ironed out. That is always a very natural moment after a big COP such as the one that we had in Durban for countries to sit back, read what they have agreed to once again calmly at home and go, oh, wait a minute, exactly what does this phrase mean? And then come and consult with each other about the interpretation of agreements. But that occurred earlier in the year, and I believe that all governments are now pretty well clear on what they have agreed and how they can move all of those agreements forward in Doha.
If we can talk briefly about two of the major players who perhaps aren't always pulling in the way that everyone wants to, the USA and China, both will have, at least by the time we get to Doha, have had leadership elections,
changes.
not both changes. But in terms of starting with the US, in the absence of joining the Kyoto Protocol, and I know you know US politics very well, that's not going to happen. What message would you expect, or could we expect from them in Doha? What would you like to see from them as a show of ambition?
Well, I think the question is actually more what is the opportunity for the United States now in a second term of President Obama, where Doha is only one chapter, but where we should really be looking at the 4 years of this administration. And I do think there that the United States now, in a second presidency of President Obama, has a very real opportunity to strengthen its participation on climate change, both domestically, where what the United States has been doing is a combination of some federal regulation, in particular on transportation and on new coal plants, and combining that with activities, actions on the ground, either at the city level or at the state level. So all of those are already in place. The United States has the opportunity now with a much clearer political mandate, because we all heard President Obama in his acceptance speech say that he's not willing to look at a future that would be threatened by increasing global temperatures. So they do have the opportunity to use everything that they already have in place, to take it one step farther at the domestic level, and at the international level, to also strengthen their participation, both with respect to their support for developing countries and what they are doing, as well as increase their leadership to ensure that governments will take on a universal agreement in the year 2015.
And I guess Chinese policy is slightly more predictable, although seasoned Chinese observers might disagree with that, but they have their 5-year plans. How important for you is it that China maintains its trajectory of showing, low carbon leadership around the world?
It's absolutely critical. Because China is the largest developing country economy, and also very quickly moving into the first place on carbon emissions, but also just because of the credibility and the authority that China is in the world. And there I'm actually quite delighted to have heard over the past few days that China has now, in fact, even increased its target and is considering to generate 30% of its electricity production from renewable energy by the year 2015, which is a remarkable target that they're taking on. And I think we all know when China decides they're going to do something, not only do they do it, they achieve it and go even beyond. So I have no doubt that they're going to actually do that. They also have very, very strict policies on energy efficiency, in particular on buildings. There's no country in the world that is building as much as China. So they're taking this very seriously. Not because, let me be very clear, not because they want to save the planet. They're doing this because it is in their domestic interest. And that is where I see there is such opportunity for short-term, immediate action of many countries to realize that, by and large, the measures that they take to address global climate change are actually in their national domestic interest. And I think the more countries realize that, the more we will see action on the ground.
And another bloc which, I guess, shows leadership and is expected to show leadership in Doha is the EU. We all know that Connie Hedegaard, the Climate Commissioner, is a vociferous supporter of stronger climate action, but it's slightly more complex when you look at all the countries beneath her. How important is it, do you think, that the AAU situation is resolved by the time we start negotiations in Doha?
Well, it is very clear, as you mentioned, that the EU, not just Connie Hedegaard, but the EU as a whole, have been traditionally leaders in the fight against climate, and we're grateful to them. They were also leaders in saying very clearly that they were committed to a second commitment period in the Kyoto Protocol, and they will be accompanied now by a set of countries, but they were clearly leaders in that. And they have said that because it is important to them that the Kyoto Protocol continues to be the mark of leadership of industrialized countries with respect to mitigation, as well as the repository of the rules and the accounting systems that give environmental integrity to the climate regime. So for both reasons, the European Union, but also the world, can expect that that is the importance of the Kyoto Protocol. What is going to be done about the AAUs, about the carryover, as we call it, is one of the various issues. In fact, there are 5 still issues pending in order to agree. And I do think that the European Union has been quite active in its conversations with its partners to come to a resolution about that in Doha in order to allow the second commitment period to start.
If they don't, is it going to be hard for them to show the same kind of dynamic leadership that Connie Hedegaard managed to display in Durban?
No, I don't expect EU to come with any less leadership than they did in Durban. They have been staunch supporters of the regime, and I expect them to continue to do that.
In terms of another big issue this week, the EU ETS and particularly the aviation situation, how disappointing was that for you that I guess they've given the International Aviation Authority another year to try and come to some resolution? Was that the EU backing down in the face of Russia, China and the USA?
No, to the contrary, I actually see it very positively, because the EU had taken unilateral measures that they see that they needed in order to be consistent with their national policy and their emissions trading scheme. So that was understandable from their perspective. But from the perspective of the other countries, that was very much seen as a unilateral measure. The EU had been very clear from the beginning that if there was a possibility of an international agreement, that they would then take all their unilateral measures off the table. So I actually very much welcome that ICAO, being the international repository for the conversation around aviation, has actually stepped up to the plate and has agreed that they will embark over the next year in their conversations around enabling a market mechanism that will make it possible to bring down international aviation emissions in a fair way for all countries. So I see that as a very, very positive development, and I also see that the EU is only being consistent with what it said from the beginning. If there's an international regulation, we will take our unilateral measures off the table. That's what they're doing for the time being. They've also been very clear in saying if those international agreements do not take place, they would have to continue with their unilateral. But I have faith in the international process, and I do believe that ICAO will take the responsible leadership forward.
One of the interesting aspects of Durban was the partnership between the EU and AOSIS, the small island states, and the LDCs, the least developed countries. Over the past year, that seems to have become an increasingly strained relationship, particularly in Bonn, and perhaps the Bangkok talks change that a bit. How important do you think it is that we see more examples of, I guess, cross-cutting relationships growing amongst all the countries? Because there's this firewall that seems to have blighted these talks for the last 20 years, and this seemed to be an example of, countries reaching out, maybe not getting burnt, but, reaching out to each other. How important is it that we see that particular relationship continue, and also similar sort of trust-building, confidence-building measures?
I think it's critically important, and it is important for governments to, from the point of view of their own national interest, to explore where do they have common interest with other countries and with other blocks of countries, because it is precisely through those very strategic alliances that countries can much more effectively, much quicker fashion, come to common ground and to agreements that then allow the other countries to fall into place. So it's a very welcome development, and I see it not just with the EU and AOSIS, but also the participation of the African countries, of the LDCs, of the Cartagena group, of the Algarve group. I mean, you can just go on and on. The list is a long list of countries that have really understood that they are better off looking for allies and then crossing the aisles, so to speak, to find common ground with groups of countries who are not necessarily 100% aligned with them, but where there is a very constructive possibility for common ground.
Finance is clearly an issue which has, I guess, hurt the trust between the developed and developing countries. There clearly doesn't seem to me, but talking to people, there are not going to be any new pledges on the table here in Doha. What else can we see? What else would you hope might be on the table apart from hard cash?
Finance is a critical question, and it is most unfortunate that the entire world is now mired in the financial constraints that everyone is under. So it's a very unfortunate timing. I think that is why we would most likely not see pledges of specific amounts of funding in Doha. What we can see and what we must see is all industrialized countries giving very serious consideration and capturing into text how is it that they will get to be able to ramp up from where they are now, which is the end of the Fast Start finance, to the up to 100 billion that they have promised by 2020. So there is a period in which they need to grow up to that amount. And of course, they need to be very strategic in where those sources are going to come from and how they will leverage each other in order to get to the 100 billion. But serious thought needs to be given to that, and developing countries must get to the point where they can actually trust what is being put on the table. And I think that's going to be the challenge. The offer from industrialized countries needs to be serious and credible enough, and the offer needs to be received with enough trust. It is a challenge.
And do we need to see a bit more understanding from some of those poorer countries that, fine, the money may come in 2020, but some of the more developed countries are in a sticky patch at the moment?
Well, the money cannot come in 2020. The money must come between now and 2020. Sure. And I do think that everybody realizes that these countries, everybody watches the news, reads the newspapers, so we all know that industrialized countries are having a very, very difficult financial time. So I think that is part of the reality that countries go into Doha with. Nonetheless, there must be a plan toward the 100 billion.
Okay, two more quick questions, because I know you're very busy today. How do you think the Qatari presidency is going to get around the impression that many people have that they are perhaps not the puppets of big oil, but certainly in their pocket, with the president's former president of OPEC, who was Petroleum Executive of the Year in 2008, and yesterday he said that shale gas was the future for 300 years. Many people in civil society are increasingly worried, people I've spoken to, about the influence that the Qataris could have on these talks. What assurances can you give them that these talks will remain focused on a low-carbon future?
I've been very impressed with what the Qatari presidency has done over the past 11 months. They came into this, frankly, as relative novices, because they had not been one of the countries that had been one of the most active or thoughtful participants in the climate process over the past 10 years. So the fact that they took the initiative to even offer to host and to even fight to become the host for 2 years really demonstrated that they were committed to this, that they really wanted to learn and to play an important role. Over the past 11 months, it has been very clear that the Qatari president has taken this extremely seriously. They have really grown in their understanding of the complexity of all of the issues that are on the table, which are many, and they're all very much interlinked. And I have no doubt that they are committed to a COP that is not only going to be successful in format, but that is actually going to be successful in substance, because they fully understand that they, being one of the very vulnerable countries to water and food production in the world, and this is something that is very little known. Qatar has no rivers. It has no fresh water whatsoever. It doesn't have a lake. It doesn't have rivers. It is surrounded around 3 sides by the ocean. Every single drop of water that is used in Qatar needs to be desalinated. Every single gram of food that is eaten in Qatar needs to be either imported or needs to be grown with desalinated water. Climate change and increasing temperatures is making Qatar even more vulnerable to the lack of water and and food insecurity. So they understand that although they are a gas-producing nation and a gas-exporting nation, they are also vulnerable, and they have actually taken a very interesting international leadership in helping some other countries that are also suffering from food insecurity to deal with this. Finally, what I'm very impressed with in Qatar is they do have a pledge to generate 1,800 megawatts of solar power in order to desalinate their surrounding water, and they're going to be helping other countries to further develop that technology. Desalination through solar energy is going to be very, very critical for many of the countries that have high insulation but low water resources, and I have no doubt that Qatar is going to contribute to this.
Okay, final question. What kind of confidence-building measures would you be hoping to see in that first week in Doha? Perhaps, pledges that KP2 is going to be signed off, that the LCA is going to be finished. What would you like to see? What would you like to hear?
The first confidence-building measure we've already heard, that Australia, that had not been at all clear about whether it's going to join the Kyoto Protocol, has said that they stand ready to join the second commitment period. So that's already one of the very good confidence-building measures that everyone is celebrating and going into Doha with. And other than that, coming out of the pre-COP, where there were 45 ministers of state in their last opportunity to come together to prepare Doha, I heard every single one of the ministers say they're going to Doha dedicated to figure out where the common ground is, dedicated to having an agreement, and dedicating to making sure that Doha will take the step from design to implementation, and that it will be a very, very firm launching ground for the ADP. So all the trust building that I needed, I think it's already on the table.